Wife, mother, debutante, black widow. Such are the crimes of one Susan Gerund, whose escapades rocked a small Indiana town several years ago. I originally did this a couple of years ago, but I decided to freshen it up and bring it back to you for this Keto and Crime classic. Let's dive in. Susan Gerund.
Keto and crime, keto and crime. We uncover the grime on keto and crime. Keto and crime, keto and crime. Now is the time for keto and crime.
Hey everyone, Tracy here from Keto and Crime. Thank you so much to every single one of my patrons and channel members. You make this possible. And you're one of the reasons I do this. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if I haven't said it before, thank you. I'll sing it. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there with me and letting me geek out, not making fun of me like a lot of other people do, because I like weird stuff about crime and dark history. Thanks, everyone. Okay, let's get into Murder in a Small Town. Susan Gerund. But let's get into this murder, shall we? Susan Gerund was born Sue Ann Sanders, 1958, in the very small farming community of Peru, Indiana. She was one of 7 children raised by factory worker William, who, with all accounts, was an abusive alcoholic, and homemaker Nellie Sanders. Her father, William, worked in a steel mill, which Indiana, especially that part of Indiana, was historically part of the Rust Belt, and a lot of different kinds of manufacturing took place there. So blue-collar way of life was not unusual in those small towns outside Chicago and Indianapolis. And that's the type of lifestyle that Susan grew up with. Not quite rich, but not quite poor either. They had a decent way of life, but the problem was that her father tended to drink away his troubles, abuse both her siblings, and her mother. And her mother kind of stood by and let this go on, as lots of housewives did in the 50s and 60s, because divorce just wasn't done. So, by all accounts, Susan was an abused child, witnessed a lot of abuse, and later on said that her father had sexually abused her, which she said set her on a life of treating sex as a way to get what she wanted from men, because she felt that was all she had to offer, because she felt that that was all she had to offer to her father, as sick and twisted as that is. So that kind of carried on into her later years. She actually had the reputation in high school of being called one-night stand Sue Ann, because she did sleep around quite a bit with both high school boys and older men in the town, which prompted her to drop out of high school at the age of 17 and go east for about 20 miles to the small Indiana town of 𝐲𝐿, which was another manufacturing type of town, and there she married Ronnie Lovell in 1975, who was a musician. He traveled all around the Midwest doing band gigs, and Susan traveled with him, helping to move equipment, kind of like a roadie, and by all accounts, a groupie, because she had a sexual itch that had to be scratched, and therefore she had affairs and one-night stands all over the Midwest whenever they would travel for Ronnie's band gigs. And Ronnie kind of turned a blind eye to it, because he said as a musician, he was a heavy drinker, also a womanizer, so it was just kind of one of those bad situations. But unfortunately, like a lot of artists, and I can contest being a comedian, that it doesn't always pay the bills. That's why I have a day job. He actually moved her and him to his hometown of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, so that he could take a construction job during the day and still pursue his music at night and on weekends. While in Oklahoma City, Ronnie was gone a lot. He worked about 60 hours a week in construction, then traveled a lot for his band. Susan grew tired of being on the road and also kind of being under his watchful eyes. He got more privy to what was going on. So they settled into an apartment building where Susan actually took a job as an assistant manager for the apartment building, giving them a discount off their rent, as well as allowing her to kind of socialize, because she literally met everyone that came into the building, because it was one of her jobs to collect rent and kind of take applications for new tenants. Well, she met a truck driver by the name of Gary Campbell. He was 24, she was about 22 at the time, and they started a affair that went on right under Ronnie's nose, because Ronnie was gone so much. She would simply go over to Campbell's apartment, bim bang boom, there you go. Well, during the course of this affair, she did get pregnant by Mr. Campbell, and subsequently left her husband, divorced her husband in 1979, and married Gary Campbell, and gave birth to their son Jacob later that same year. But as I said, Mr. Campbell was an over-the-road truck driver, and was gone just like Ronnie for weeks at a time. And Susan began to not only have affairs around Oklahoma City, she would also leave and take Jacob and go visit her mom and sister, Darlene, in Peru. And while there, she would leave her son with her family, take off her wedding ring, and go hit the bars with her old high school girlfriends, and ended up sleeping around with a lot of men in Peru as well. She did move back to Oklahoma City. She did stay with Gary quite a while, but while in Oklahoma City, she decided she was kind of bored with the managing of the apartment building, and kind of moved into the manufacturing part and got a job at Perry Filters. They made filters for HVAC units, various types of machinery, which is one of the largest manufacturing plants there. And while there, she started having more and more affairs. And it was around this time Gary Campbell noted that her interest in kink, or sadomasochistic type of sex, came to fruition. That many times she would attack him. She even stabbed him in the chest. It wasn't like a deadly wound, but it was enough to get his attention. And she would also stab him in the leg on one occasion. And after both times, she immediately wanted to turn sexual, because the violence kind of gave her a sadistic high. So Gary, not knowing quite what to do, indulged her in those fantasies. Well, while at Perry Filters, she began an affair with the owner of the company's former son-in-law. The owner of the company still doted on his son-in-law and grandson, because his daughter, whom Tom Whitted, who was his former son-in-law, was married to, had passed away from cancer 6 months prior. So he had made it his mission to make sure that his former son-in-law and his grandson had everything that they needed. And as a result, Mr. Whitted was quite well off, because he got a lot of the proceeds from the manufacturing plant plus family money. So you could say he was doing pretty well. But he was a single father, and he was very lonely. He missed his wife very much, and as a result was very vulnerable to Susan, who had since dropped the name of Sue Ann. She thought Susan made her sound less trailer trash. Her words, not mine. But he was very vulnerable to Susan's advances, and fell madly in love with her, so he thought. Turned out to be just more of an infatuation, but the two did get married in 1982. She divorced Gary, got custody of Jacob, and set into living with Tom and his young son, Tom Jr. Both Jacob and Tom Jr. were about 3 years old at the time of their marriage. Just a few weeks after their wedding, Tom Jr. was taken to the hospitals with a concussion and severe brain swelling while in Susan's care. Susan told the doctors and her husband that he had fallen on some concrete steps, and that is what happened. Being that there had never been any other incidents, of course they believed her story, because in the 80s, child abuse wasn't treated as a criminal offense, as bad as that sounds. It was more something that was treated internally and domestically as a family issue. So there wasn't a whole lot of investigation into this. They simply took her word that he had fallen. About 6 months later, though, Tom Jr. was back in the hospital again with brain swelling, and this time he lapsed into a coma, which he barely woke up from. He was near death, and as a result had permanent brain damage and would forever be in a vegetative state. So as you can imagine, this was more than just a family matter that was to be dealt with domestically. The police did get involved. They investigated Susan. They questioned her again. She said he fell out of his high chair and struck his head, that he was the clumsiest boy ever. Tom's sister-in-law, former sister-in-law, came forward and said that Tom Jr. had told her on many occasions that Mommy hits me. She dropped me on my head. I don't understand why she didn't come forward to at least her brother-in-law before all of this. And they also questioned Jacob, who was, again, not much older than Tom Jr., and he confessed that he had witnessed his mother spank and beat Jacob for no good reason many, many times, but was just scared to say anything. So she was charged with 8 counts of child abuse and child endangerment. She did plead that down to 1 count of child beating and received a 5-year suspended sentence, which included 5 years of probation, and subsequently, of course, was divorced by Whitted, sued by Whitted's father-in-law, who chastised and blamed his son-in-law for not recognizing the devil that he had married. Those were his words. And eventually lost custody of Jacob to her ex-husband, Gary Campbell, who went to live with Mr. Campbell at that time. She was, at the time, 3 months pregnant by Whitted. Of course, he wanted nothing more to do with her, didn't really want anything to do with a child that they would have together. He was too consumed caring for now a vegetative son, so she left Oklahoma City and moved back to her hometown of Peru, Indiana, and there started doing her old ways, dating various men, having one-night stands with various men while living with her mother. Some of the men she messed around with were in law enforcement in Peru, and they decided they would set her up as a joke with one of the local prosecutors, Jim Gerund. Jim Gerund was from a long-respected family of lawyers and attorneys, therefore very heavily connected with law enforcement, and he had recently divorced his longtime wife, Jane. Although he and Jane were still very good friends, and for the good of their children, they were still living in the same house so that they could raise their 2 children, Jamma and David, what they called properly. However, this all ended when he met Susan on that blind date in 1984 and fell madly in love with her. Some women have all the luck, don't they? Jim Gerund was 39, Susan was 25 at the time, and as you can imagine, having the affections of a woman 14 years younger than you is quite an ego boost. I can tell you, my wife's 10 years younger than me. It is quite an ego boost. But, just kidding. Don't tell my wife I said that. They dated for several months, and baby 𝐲𝐿, who was the daughter of Tom Whitted and Susan, was born December 4th, 1984. 2 days after her birth, Jim, who had stood in during the birth as a surrogate father, and Susan took the baby down to Florida, to Flagler Beach, where they married on December 6th, just 2 days after 𝐲𝐿's birth. He wanted them to be a happy family, so he used his connections and money to help get Jacob back from Gary Campbell. He moved Gary Campbell to Indiana, to a manufacturing town about 20 miles east of Peru, and at that time got him a job as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant, making far more money than he ever made being a truck driver, which he had to give up because of caring for a son on his own. So he helped get him out of the financial dilemma he was in, because he had lost his job, very well-paying job as an over-the-road truck driver to care for his son, couldn't find a job that would allow him to be a single father, so had fallen on hard times. And so he took the offer of a move to a small town with a good job, took him up on that right away. While there, he allowed Susan, against court order, to babysit Jacob while he worked. Of course, Jacob wanted his mommy and began crying after her. About this time, Gary met a woman at the manufacturing plant where he was working, wanted to get married, and they agreed they didn't want the burden of a child. I feel so sorry for these kids. Didn't want the burden of a child, so he willingly signed over custody of Jacob to Susan. In the meantime, Jim had also been working on the Whitted family. They signed over custody. Tom Whitted signed over custody of 𝐝𝐤, whom he had never laid eyes on, to Susan, and Jim formally adopted both children by the end of 1985. From 1985 to 1992, Jim and Susan were the toast of the town. They were always in the highlight. They were the center of Peru's social scene amongst the doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs that made up the higher echelons of the Midwest living in that small town. However, Susan was still a flirt. She carried on a lot of affairs with a lot of doctors and lawyers, and these same people they ran in circles with, she was still sleeping around. Jim started to key in on that and found out about it. He really wanted to settle down, but evidently she did not, and he started noticing her behavior. She would also flirt with the friends that they hung around with, their husbands. None of them liked her. She was just kind of considered a pariah in town. She also had a very bad relationship with Jama and David Gerund, who were Jim's children by his former wife, Jane. She didn't treat them very well. She worked on Jim, insisted that Jim change his will to include her two children, 𝐝𝐤 and Jacob, as equal heirs with his children, even wanting more money for them, and convinced Jim to take out a $250,000 life insurance policy, which in the late 80s, early 90s was a lot of money, to make her and them the sole beneficiaries, leaving his other children out of the picture. And Jim, not wanting to deal with her because she had quite a temper, did just that. However, by early 1982, summer 1992, Jim had had enough of it, and he actually visited a fellow attorney that was a divorce attorney and asked what he would need to do to start divorce proceedings. So in July, August, the family did go on a vacation to Alaska. While there, Jim told Susan he would be filing for divorce. As soon as they got home, he would be changing his will, making Jama and David his majority heirs. He would take care of 𝐝𝐤 and Jacob, but he was also going to take care of his other children. He would also be changing the life insurance policy to make them all equal beneficiaries on that, and that's the way it was going to be. Well, that didn't sit well with Susan, and after a huge fight, and she calmed down, she decided that she would get her way. And so they returned home August 1st, 1990, but by August 3rd when it really came to a head. Unfortunately, Jim never changed the will or the life insurance. Susan made sure that he never had the opportunity, which I think was bad on his part. But August 3rd, 1994, after taking Jacob to a camping trip, and then going to pick up her niece to spend the night with her daughter 𝐝𝐤, she came home at around 10 p.m. and put the two girls, 7-year-old girls, down in front of the television, went up to their bedroom, and there she said she saw Jim slumped across the couch as if he were asleep. She went over to check on him and said she noticed some blood dripping from the corner of his mouth, and then noticed he had been shot through the eye, the left eye. She immediately called 911 and told them she found her husband shot. They immediately came in. Now, being that he was such a high-powered attorney in town and they were well-known, the crime scene was filled with people that shouldn't be there. We're talking not only the police, the coroner, you had a judge that was a good friend of Jim Gerund that stopped by. You had all kinds of friends, family, a lot of people that should never have been in a crime scene milling about. But anyway, they took Jim away. He was pronounced dead, of course, through a gunshot wound to the eye, and they immediately began questioning Susan and the rest of the family. They began searching the homes of not only Susan and Jim, but the Gerund family and Susan's family as well. And immediately after she heard they had searched her mother Natalie's house, but it turns out that the bullet they retrieved from Jim's eye was a 9mm bullet. And David Gerund, who had just finished college at the time, was home, and he said that he had a 9mm gun that was stolen on July 4th. And what had happened was he had bought the gun for protection. He told his father that he was going to have the license for the gun mailed to their house instead of his apartment, and could he drop that by. Well, Susan actually brought that license by David Grund's apartment on July 4th, about 1994, about a month before the shooting, and asked to see the gun. David said he thought it was strange, but he showed her the gun. It was hidden in his nightstand, and she said, "Oh, great," and then kind of left. Well, he and his girlfriend went to the fireworks that night, came home about midnight, and said that the screen had been slashed, the door kicked in. He searched the house. It was kind of ransacked, but the only thing missing was that gun, and he thought that was incredibly strange. So he did report this to the police. He also made sure that they knew that it was stolen before he ever had a chance to really use it. He said he did fire at one time out at an old light post that was no longer active behind his apartment building. And they asked him, did he actually strike the light post? He said yes. So the police went out, searched the light post, extracted the bullet, compared it with the bullet that had been taken out of Jim Grund's eye. They were an identical match. So it was that he was killed with his son's gun. Barring the conversation about the gun, Natalie, who was Susan's mother, began questioning her about what she meant. Was there a gun? She said, and she kind of shook it off. She said, "Oh no, nothing." But on September 2nd, she did confide in her sister, Darlene Warden, that she did kill Jimmy. And this was because she had moved outside of Peru to kind of get the heat off of her, and asked Darlene to move into her and Jim's old house to kind of house sit it and kind of report back when the police searched it and things of that nature. And Darlene had noticed that there was a teddy bear that was in a glass case in the bedroom that Susan had told her not to touch because it was a collector's item. So Darlene didn't think much about it, but as soon as the police came for about the third time to search the house, and she called Susan to let her know, hey, they're here searching, again, Susan asked, did they find the gun? And Darlene was kind of taken aback. What do you mean? She says, I'm coming over. So Suzanne drove over. September 2nd, she did confess that to her sister, she had shot Jimmy to prevent him from changing his will and to prevent him to change the life insurance. And she had hidden the gun in that teddy bear. At that time, she took the teddy bear with her back to her mom's house. She told her mom what she was going to do. She took the gun in the teddy bear up to her mother's attic, placed it in an old wash tub, filled it with cement, and hid it in her mom's attic. So Nellie and I called her Natalie earlier, but her mom name is Nellie. I'm sorry about that. But Nellie and Darlene sat on this information for about 2 months, not knowing quite what to do. Now, it was obvious that Susan may be sexy, but she sure as hell wasn't smart, because this is just the most messed up way to hide a murder I've ever heard of in my life. But conscience finally got to them, and they told investigators about the teddy bear, about the confession, and about the bucket of cement. Police went and found the bucket of cement, broke into it, found the teddy bear with the gun inside, and was able to, at that point, tie Susan to the murder of Jim Grund and stop her from collecting $250,000 worth of life insurance. September 27th, 1993, her trial began. During the trial, she blamed her stepson David Grund for the murder, saying the two had started an illicit affair and that he killed Jim in a jealous rage. David vehemently denied that had ever happened. He said, she's a liar. She's always been a liar. And as far as the verdict in that trial, the jury of 12 men, because Susan's attorney had said that she could not receive a fair trial in Peru and had wanted it moved to Indianapolis or some other larger venue. That was granted in part because they did have the trial in Peru, but the jurors were brought in from a town 30 miles south, so that no one really knew about the Grunds or had connections with the Grunds. So those 12 jurors deliberated for 15 hours before they came out that they were hopelessly hung, and a mistrial was declared. March 1994, the state retried Susan Grund, and at that point, the prosecution did not change their story one bit, that she murdered Jim Grund for financial gain, and giving what had happened with her violence in the past with her husbands and her former stepson. She was found guilty of the murder of Jim Grund and sentenced to 60 years. Her children, Tennille and Jacob, were raised by the Grund family, specifically by Jim's sister and his wife and her husband. And she is serving her sentence to this day in the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis. She is eligible for parole in 2025. She exhausted all of her appeals. The last one was denied by the Indiana Supreme Court in 2012. And that is the tragic story of the Gerund family. Again, just like with Susan Smith, we have a woman here that was sexually abused and used sex as her only currency for many years, and in the end, it ended up in a violent, twisted end. So what do you guys think? Let me know below if you'd heard of this case, if you enjoyed this case, and believe me, I've seen all your suggestions. I'll be doing all the cases you suggested for me, either as a part of normal Sunday Bloody Sunday, or as part of 31 days of uploading in October, which I'm going to be doing half spooky story times and half true crime. So I'll be getting to all of them. I really appreciate everyone watching my channel. Thank you so much. Like, comment, share, subscribe. 𝐲𝐿𝐲, y'all. Keto Comic. Out.